The earliest impressions left within the fabric of the galaxy are neither monuments nor relics, but distortions in its balance. Worlds scarred long before recorded time, systems stripped of energy with precision beyond natural decay, and stellar patterns interrupted as if drawn into design rather than randomness. In every region touched, observers from later millennia noted a strange consistency, the absence of chance. The Administratum would later describe such irregularities as the evidence of forces predating the warp-born gods, forces that imposed will not through cult or corruption, but through raw dominion over matter itself. Records compiled across scattered Xenos ruins identified repeated motifs, beings depicted not as kings or generals, but as light refracted into form, embodiments of power unconfined by mortality. These impressions spanned otherwise disconnected civilizations, from the earliest Necrontyr script fragments to distant Eldari myths. They pointed to a singular category of influence, entities not worshipped into existence, but discovered in the fabric of reality, awakened by those capable of perceiving their presence. Only after these imprints are catalogued does the name emerge. The C'tan, later translated by Imperial archivists as star gods, represented a class of beings without equal in material space. They did not emerge from the immaterium like the ruinous powers, nor from natural evolution like the races of the galaxy. Instead, they are described as vast, conscious patterns of energy coalescing around the power of stars. Their essence was radiant, sustained by stellar furnaces, and their movement traced across void as if the cosmos itself carried them. Unlike psychic entities, they did not require belief to exist. Their nature was embedded in physics itself, in the transfer of light, heat, and gravitational force. To encounter one was not to face an apparition, but a presence bound into reality as unavoidably as gravity or entropy. The origins of the C'tan are linked inseparably with the Necrontyr, a mortal species whose fate became the crucible for these beings' emergence into the material domain. The Necrontyr inhabited a dying existence, cursed by biology and condemned by their own star's radiation. Their short, painful lives bred resentment and hostility, and across their empire, bitterness became a unifying constant. It was within this cultural despair that the first recognition of the C'tan occurred. Observing the heavens not as symbols but as energy, the Necrontyr identified anomalies among the stars, movements that suggested will where there should have been only fire. They constructed devices of living metal to attract and ensnare these stellar intelligences, giving shape to what had previously been formless. Through this act, the C'tan were not merely noticed but embodied. Energy became form as the Necrontyr provided them with necrodermis shells, living metal constructs capable of containing and focusing their near-infinite radiance. The relationship was transformative for both sides. For the Necrontyr, it was the first answer to their curse, allies who offered strength, immortality, and vengeance against the hated Old Ones who had denied them supremacy. For the C'tan, embodiment provided tools of interaction, a means to impose will with structure and strategy. No longer diffuse, they could move through battlefields, command legions, and consume life with efficiency. The biological form of the Necrontyr is essential to understand their desperation. Accounts preserved within fragmented Necron archives describe them as humanoid in stature, but elongated, with fragile frames and sallow, desiccated flesh. Their average height exceeded that of baseline humans, though their weight remained low due to thin bone structures adapted poorly to their home star's constant radiation. Eyes were recessed, their colorations dimmed into pale shades from exposure. When the C'tan began to exert influence through their hosts, their methods reflected not spirituality but precision. They devoured solar energy, feeding on the life of stars as easily as mortals consume food. In some accounts, they were observed drawing sustenance not only from celestial bodies, but also from living beings, stripping vitality in an instant. Unlike demonic predators, this consumption left no warp taint, only silence where once there had been motion. Entire battlefields were reduced to husks with no lingering corruption, as if life itself had been neatly erased. The military doctrine that emerged under their patronage reshaped the Necrontyr into something greater than mortal ambition could have achieved. Recruitment ceased to be voluntary. Entire populations were reconstituted as legions in service to their starborn patrons. Strategy shifted from attrition and technological reliance toward annihilation, executed with mathematical precision. The C'tan demanded obedience not through charisma, but inevitability. Their presence overwhelmed any concept of resistance. To fight under their gaze was to become an extension of cosmic force. Necrontyr rulers who resisted were eradicated or subsumed, their authority replaced by the living metal avatars that embodied these new gods. Yet even in this transformation, the C'tan retained their alien detachment. They did not view their legions as equals, nor even as tools with individuality. To them, armies were extensions of their will, conduits to enact their hunger. The Necrons waged wars of extermination at their command, not for territory or resources, but to fuel the ascension of beings whose nature was consumption itself. Recruitment became conquest. Every enemy slain was not merely defeated, but reduced into sustenance. The universe itself became a resource to be harvested. This origin point marked the beginning of the war in heaven, where the C'tan and their Necron hosts turned against the Old Ones with catastrophic effect. The doctrines of annihilation and systemic targeting reflected the precision of their cosmic masters. They did not wage wars of ideology but wars of erasure, striking at species not for rivalry but for sustenance. For the Necrons, this served their long-held hatred of the Old Ones, but for the C'tan, it was nothing more than expansion of hunger. The galaxy itself was their battlefield, every star a potential feast, every civilization a potential harvest. The C'tan, once bound within the necrodermis shells forged by the Necrontyr, presented a paradoxical form of embodiment. Though their true essence remained stellar energy, their containment granted shape and function, allowing them to interact with the material realm with the precision of a war engine and the majesty of divinity. The technology that made this possible was the pinnacle of Necrontyr science. Necrodermis, a living metal capable of self-repair, adaptation, and infinite reinforcement. In its base state, Necrodermis appeared as liquid metal, reflective and fluid, but once applied to contain a C'tan, it solidified into a structure capable of channeling unfathomable energy. The Necrontyr did not invent Necrodermis so much as discover it, for its properties remain unmatched even in the most advanced technologies of the Mechanicus millennia later. The containment process gave rise to forms that varied between individuals. Some C'tan chose avatars shaped with humanoid symmetry, a reflection of their Necrontyr hosts, while others expressed themselves through alien geometries, jagged silhouettes, or luminous shards that resisted full comprehension. Despite this variety, all C'tan forms shared traits: immense stature, metallic luster that seemed alive under starlight, and the ability to fracture into radiant energy before reconstituting at will. They did not require weapons as mortals understood them, for their very essence could be focused into beams of annihilation, arcs of stellar flame, or gravitational distortions capable of crushing entire formations. Yet many carried weapons or tools as symbols, artifacts wrought not for necessity but for representation, reflecting their role as gods among their mortal subjects. Vehicles in the conventional sense were redundant to the C'tan, for they traversed space by bending light and gravity around their forms. However, the legions that served them operated with immense arrays of war engines, all designed to augment the destructive will of their patrons. Monoliths, obelisks, and pylons of Necrodermis served as both transport and weapon, moving with slow inevitability, yet carrying firepower capable of unmaking cities. It is believed these constructs were not merely engineered machines, but ritualistic extensions of the C'tan's authority, each designed to embody their dominion over physical law. The armies of the Necrons thus reflected the metaphysical nature of their gods. Not mobile warfare in the style of humans or Eldari, but inexorable advance, a wave of inevitability from which no defense could stand. To discuss the social structure of the C'tan requires caution, for they are not a society in the mortal sense. Unlike species with hierarchies based on survival or reproduction, the C'tan existed as unique, individual entities, each one an absolute being. There was no collective framework to bind them, no shared culture beyond their shared hunger for energy. Their values were reflections of cosmic appetites, not moral systems. Each C'tan pursued dominion in ways that aligned with its essence. Some, like the Deceiver, favoured manipulation and gradual erosion of trust, while others, such as the Nightbringer, embodied direct consumption and death on a massive scale. Together they represented facets of reality elevated to sentience, deception, hunger, entropy, war. Nevertheless, a form of hierarchy did exist, though imposed externally. Among the Necrontyr, the C'tan were revered as gods, elevated beyond kings and dynasties. Their word superseded the authority of any mortal ruler, including the Silent King himself. Each dynasty often aligned with a specific C'tan, integrating its influence into their cultural and military doctrine. A Necron phalanx led by the Nightbringer's cult would fight with ruthless efficiency, while one bound to the Deceiver might rely more on psychological warfare and subterfuge. In this way, the C'tan indirectly established a form of societal stratification. Their personalities shaped the cultures of their followers, even if they themselves lacked the concept of structured society. The values of the C'tan, insofar as they can be described, revolved around consumption, dominance, and permanence. They had no tolerance for weakness, and they showed no loyalty to one another beyond temporary convenience. Alliances between them often collapsed into conflict, as each sought supremacy over both their peers and their servants. Unlike mortals, they did not age or fear death. Their only vulnerability lay in the necrodermis shells that contained them. This permanence gave them an arrogance that mortals mistook for divinity. To the C'tan, lesser beings were resources, fuel to be consumed or tools to be wielded. Their values were stripped of empathy or reciprocity. They recognized no inherent worth in life other than its energy content. Roles within their structure reflected this detachment. Among mortals there existed priesthoods and cults who maintained rituals in their name, but these practices were more for the mortals themselves than for the gods they worshipped. The C'tan did not require prayer, they required energy. As such, the civilian role under their rule was reduced to servitude. To live was to feed the machine of war, to die was to provide fuel for it. Soldiers, by contrast, were extensions of the C'tan's will, their individuality erased through biotransference. The transformation into Necrons ensured that roles were absolute, immortality at the cost of self, obedience at the cost of freedom. The military became the totality of society, as every Necron was both citizen and soldier in a structure designed for eternal war. Leadership among the Necrons remained technically with the Silent King and the dynastic pharaohs, yet in truth, it was the C'tan who shaped decisions. Dynastic rulers were permitted authority so long as it aligned with the goals of their patron deity. When divergence occurred, the C'tan intervened directly, erasing resistance without hesitation. The Silent King, though revered, was still bound by the cosmic will of the beings he had unleashed. His later betrayal of the C'tan, in orchestrating their shattering into shards, underscores the tension between mortal leadership and divine domination. Until that moment, however, the Necrons existed within a hierarchy where gods held absolute power. Dynasties enforced it, and individuals served as its unthinking instruments. The values enforced by the C'tan also reshaped Necrontyr culture. Once obsessed with legacy and mortality, they abandoned art, philosophy, and individuality in favour of eternal obedience. Entire cultural identities were erased, replaced by the will of their patron. The Deceiver, for example, cultivated values of trickery and manipulation within his followers, teaching them to erode enemy alliances before striking. The Nightbringer conversely instilled reverence for death itself, creating cults that glorified annihilation. These values became guiding principles for dynasties, even after the C'tan were shattered, lingering within their traditions as echoes of divine influence. The social division between civilian and military roles thus collapsed entirely. There were no civilians in the traditional sense, only functionaries within the war machine. Maintenance crews, archivists, and administrators were merely specialized extensions of the military order. Even the lowest drone had a role within campaigns of extermination, whether guarding tomb complexes or ensuring the activation of war engines. For the C'tan, efficiency and obedience were the only measures of worth. In this way, their society became the antithesis of organic cultures, not dynamic, not adaptive, but static and absolute, designed to endure across eternity. The Necron military machine reflected these values in its composition. Warriors operated in perfect phalanxes, their discipline unshaken by fear or doubt, for such concepts were erased with their mortality. Command structures relied not on charisma, but on programming aligned with dynastic will. The presence of the C'tan on the battlefield further erased the distinction between leader and army, for their power dominated all tactical considerations. A single god could obliterate regiments, bend enemy morale, and reshape terrain with stellar energy. Thus, the social structure was recursive. Mortals served dynasties, dynasties served the C'tan, and the C'tan served only themselves. This pattern highlights the central paradox of their order. While appearing as a hierarchy with gods at the pinnacle, it was in reality a structure built upon exploitation. The C'tan recognized no obligations toward their servants. They did not protect or nurture, they consumed. Their values were purely extractive, reducing civilization to a means of sustaining their existence. In this sense, the society they created was not a true culture, but a harvesting apparatus, its only purpose to serve cosmic hunger. The collapse of this arrangement would come later, when the Silent King, recognizing the inevitability of annihilation should the C'tan remain unchecked, orchestrated their destruction into shards. Yet even shattered, the influence of their social structure persisted. Dynasties retained the imprint of their gods' values, traditions, and tactics. The C'tan had imposed order not merely through command, but by rewriting the cultural DNA of their servants. What remained after their fall was still shaped by their cosmic appetites, a society defined not by its own will but by the echo of beings who viewed life itself as fuel. The C'tan, once granted form by the Necrontyr, revealed instincts that were at once alien and disturbingly familiar. Though not biological creatures, they exhibited behaviors shaped by their essential nature as stellar predators. At the most fundamental level, their instinct was consumption. Energy sustained them, and all action revolved around its acquisition. Stars provided their first nourishment, and with embodiment came the capacity to feed on other forms of life, particularly organic vitality. The consumption of mortals was neither symbolic nor ritualistic. It was literal sustenance, absorbed with the same inevitability as a star radiating light. Unlike demonic entities, whose hunger was mediated by belief or psychic resonance, the C'tan devoured physical energy in its rawest form. This instinct defined every other aspect of their conduct, for their will was inseparable from their appetite. The nature of their feeding also explains much of their psychology. To the C'tan, value was measured by energy density. A sun, a planet's biosphere, or a massed army represented sustenance, while individual beings were negligible unless aggregated. This created an instinctive disregard for individuals, societies, and even entire species. They recognized no dignity in life beyond the scale at which it could be consumed. Yet this did not reduce them to simple predators. Their embodiment in necrodermis granted them personality and will, allowing them to shape instinct into strategies. One might stalk enemies across centuries, luring them into traps designed for maximum harvest, while another might descend with sudden violence, reducing worlds to silence in moments. The C'tan demonstrated a disturbing flexibility in behavior. Some, like the Deceiver, exhibited patience, subtlety, and manipulation. Its instinct for feeding was refracted through cunning, ensuring prey was weakened, divided, and delivered to consumption at minimal cost. Others, such as the Nightbringer, manifested pure directness, embodying death itself in vast fields of annihilation. This divergence suggests that while the base instinct of hunger was universal, the manner of its expression was filtered by their individual identities. Each C'tan embodied not only a cosmic appetite, but also a thematic aspect of existence. They were not gods in the sense of representing ideals created by mortals, but in that they were physical incarnations of universal forces: deception, entropy, war, death. The source of their power lay in their connection to the stars. Before embodiment, they were vast, formless energy beings that drifted through stellar furnaces, sustained by nuclear reactions and cosmic radiation. This origin granted them dominion over fundamental forces. Even bound into necrodermis shells, they retained mastery of radiation, gravitation, and thermodynamics. On battlefields, this power manifested in beams of annihilating light, arcs of stellar fire, or localized distortions of physics that could disassemble matter. The sheer scale of their abilities rendered conventional defense meaningless. Shields, armor, and terrain became irrelevant in the presence of beings whose very essence was energy unbound. The behavioral instincts of the C'tan also shaped their relationships with one another. Though each was unique, they shared the same hunger, leading inevitably to rivalry. They cooperated only so long as cooperation expanded the opportunities for consumption. Once sustenance was secured, conflict between them was common. This fractiousness undermined any true unity among them, preventing the formation of a collective will. Instead, they resembled apex predators forced into proximity, each too powerful to be subordinated yet too greedy to coexist peacefully. These conflicts often spilled into the strategies of their Necron servants, with dynasties aligned to different C'tan waging proxy wars under divine direction. Despite their immense intelligence, the C'tan lacked moral considerations. They did not distinguish between innocent and guilty, combatant and civilian, ally and enemy. Their ethics were shaped purely by necessity. What could be consumed was consumed. This amorality rendered them particularly dangerous, as they could not be negotiated with in terms familiar to mortals. Promises, treaties, and appeals to shared values were irrelevant. At most, they recognized bargains of convenience, but even these were temporary, for once a resource was no longer necessary, it was consumed or discarded. This made them treacherous patrons, as the Necrontyr discovered too late. Rituals existed within the societies that served them, but not within the C'tan themselves. Unlike warp entities, they required no worship to exist. However, Necrontyr priesthoods developed elaborate ceremonies to honor them, reflecting cultural adaptation rather than divine demand. These rituals often centered on the feeding of the gods, processions where sacrifices were presented, or wars conducted explicitly as harvests. Such practices reinforced the perception of the C'tan as deities, but in reality the beings themselves were indifferent. To them the rituals were irrelevant, their attention focused solely on the energy provided. Internal divisions among the C'tan were not structured as castes or hierarchies, but as natural divergences of essence. Each represented a distinct aspect of the cosmos. The Nightbringer embodied death and the end of life. The Deceiver embodied trickery and subversion. Others, like the Void Dragon, represented mastery over technology and machinery, while still others embodied entropy or destruction in different forms. These distinctions gave them roles within the broader Necron civilization, as each patron shaped its dynasty according to its nature. This created an illusion of division akin to castes, dynasties of death, dynasties of deception, dynasties of entropy. In truth, the divisions were reflections of their patrons' identities projected onto their servants. The source of their weakness also lies in their source of power. Because their essence was energy bound into necrodermis, they could be shattered. The process required immense effort, but once broken, the fragments remained dangerous yet no longer omnipotent. This vulnerability was ultimately exploited by the Silent King, who recognized that unchecked, the C'tan would eventually consume all life, including their own servants. The shattering of the C'tan ended their dominion, yet their shards continued to shape the galaxy, hunted and harnessed by Necron dynasties and, in rare cases, other factions. Their instincts did not diminish with fragmentation. Even as shards, they sought energy, feeding when possible and lashing out when threatened. Behaviourally, the C'tan demonstrated arrogance born of permanence. They did not consider defeat possible until it was forced upon them. This made them careless in some instances, underestimating both mortal resilience and internal treachery. Their reliance on feeding as their only imperative also limited their adaptability. They could not conceive of societies built on cooperation or altruism, for such concepts had no bearing on their existence. In this way, their instincts made them both invincible and vulnerable, invincible in power, vulnerable in predictability. In summary, the C'tan were defined by hunger, sustained by stars, empowered through necrodermis, and fractured by their own arrogance. Their instincts mirrored natural forces, inevitable, impartial, destructive. Their source of power was also their prison, granting them form but exposing them to destruction. Their behaviour imposed order upon their servants, but it was a sterile order, one designed for harvesting rather than flourishing. Even shattered, their influence persisted, shaping dynasties that still reflect their patrons' values. They remain among the most dangerous entities in the galaxy, not because they require belief, but because they do not. They are not born of thought, but of matter, bound to the laws of physics themselves. The administrative structure of the Imperium has long struggled with phenomena that resist classification within established categories. Among these, few present as many archival contradictions as the records concerning the star gods once worshipped by the Necrontyr and later shackled by their machine legions. For the Adeptus Administratum, the existence of the C'tan represents a paradox within imperial record-keeping. On one hand, there is evidence that these entities were encountered in earlier ages, particularly during archaeological expeditions into worlds rich with Necron ruins. On the other, the survival of such material threatens to destabilize the carefully maintained narrative of mankind's singular dominion under the Emperor. For this reason, the Administratum tends to either redact or recontextualize such findings. C'tan are not officially recognized within most tiers of the Lex Imperialis, and when they are acknowledged, they are often framed as Xenos war machines, or aberrant warp manifestations rather than unique stellar predators. This reframing is deliberate. The bureaucratic mandate is to ensure that the Emperor remains the ultimate apex of cosmic order, and any truth that suggests that beings of comparable scale existed before his ascension must be handled with care. The Adeptus Mechanicus approaches the C'tan from a different perspective, and their archives are less concerned with doctrinal uniformity than with technological preservation. For the priesthood of Mars, the C'tan are less mythological than they are material phenomena, fragments of stellar entities that can be studied, constrained, and in rare cases, exploited. This explains the Mechanicus' fascination with shards of C'tan, which they sometimes classify as animate data fragments or stellar machine intelligences. To the Mechanicus, a shard represents not a divinity, but an immensely advanced form of energy manipulation, one that surpasses the limits of known plasma dynamics, gravitic control, and materium restructuring. The political tension arises when such discoveries intersect with the concerns of the Administratum, which fears doctrinal contamination and loss of narrative control. The result is a long history of interdepartmental conflict, where the Administratum seeks to erase or limit records of C'tan encounters, while the Mechanicus attempts to secure and conceal the shards for its own experiments. Cooperation between the two institutions has occurred only when mutual survival is at stake. One example lies in the defense of Forge worlds situated atop dormant Necron tomb complexes. Here, Administratum and Mechanicus representatives have been forced into joint protocol. The Administratum provides the political justification for exterminatus or mass mobilization orders, framing them as responses to Xenos machine incursion. Meanwhile, the Mechanicus takes responsibility for the practical study and suppression of Necron constructs, with the unspoken understanding that any recovered materials of high value will be transported to Mechanicus-controlled vaults. This pragmatic arrangement highlights a recurring theme. The administratum enforces ideological stability, while the mechanicus pursues technical advantage. Both recognize the Catan as a danger, but each views that danger through a different lens. At the heart of their disagreement lies the political question of classification. The administratum has no framework to recognize an entity such as the Catan. They are not warp gods, and thus do not fall within the purview of the ecclesiarchy's established categories of heretical powers. Nor are they standard Xenos life forms that can be recorded within the usual notations of the Xenology's archives. For this reason, the administratum often labels them as anomalous stellar phenomena or unexplained energy events, consigning more specific reports to sealed archives accessible only to the Ordo Xenos. This political maneuver allows the Imperium to retain a simplified narrative: humanity versus the alien, the Emperor against the warp. Acknowledging beings that exist outside of either framework would complicate that narrative and introduce potential doubt about the Emperor's uniqueness as the sole supreme force within real space. The Adeptus Mechanicus resists such simplification. Within Martian cult thought, the Catan are frequently compared to fragments of the machine god, though such comparisons are deeply controversial and often suppressed within official canticles. Some sects argue that the Catan were false gods who attempted to claim divinity over the Necrontyr, but ultimately fell to the superiority of material science when shattered into shards. Others suggest that the technology displayed by the Catan is not divine at all, but instead represents the perfected culmination of natural processes. To these sects, studying the shards is not idolatry, but obedience to the quest for knowledge. This divergence of interpretation places the Mechanicus in potential conflict not only with the administratum, but also with the ecclesiarchy, which interprets any language that equates alien entities with godhood as dangerous heresy. The political agreements that have arisen around these disputes are fragile compromises rather than durable solutions. In some sectors, sealed treaties exist whereby the Mechanicus is permitted to secure alien artifacts, provided they do not publicize their findings. In exchange, the administratum agrees to redact certain battlefield reports to conceal the extent of Catan manifestations. This arrangement ensures that the average Imperial citizen never encounters the term at all. For the bulk of humanity, the Catan simply do not exist, and if they are ever described, it is in vague terms as machine demons or energy phantoms. Only the highest tiers of Imperial bureaucracy and the inner circles of the Mechanicus know the fuller truth, and even then, knowledge is fragmented by deliberate compartmentalization. The long history of conflict between the administratum and Mechanicus regarding the Catan is often hidden within bureaucratic language. Reports speak of disputes over archaeotech appropriation rights, or disagreements concerning unclassified stellar anomalies. Beneath these terms lies a struggle over power and narrative. The administratum desires to erase the Catan from the collective record to preserve ideological clarity. The Mechanicus, in contrast, seeks to preserve their existence in order to mine their secrets. Both recognize the impossibility of permanent resolution. The Catan are too powerful to ignore, yet too destabilizing to fully acknowledge. Thus, politics oscillates between suppression and exploitation, each institution wary of how much the other truly understands. When shards of Catan are recovered and imprisoned, the politics grow even more complex. In such cases, Mechanicus Magi attempt to conceal the true nature of the entity by categorizing it as an anomalous energy source. Administratum overseers may permit the classification so long as the matter remains cloaked in technical language inaccessible to ordinary bureaucrats. However, should the existence of a living fragment of a star god become widely known, it could destabilize imperial governance. In this sense, both institutions share a mutual interest in secrecy. The disagreement lies only in what is done with the knowledge: concealment alone, or concealment combined with experimentation. That tension remains unresolved, and it defines their fragile cooperation in the shadow of beings that once fed upon suns. The most enduring records of Catan involvement in warfare come not from the dark age of technology, nor from the fragmented archives of Old Night, but from encounters during the current age of the Imperium where shards have been unleashed from tomb complexes. These events have been sparse, but when they do occur, the resulting conflicts are considered among the most dangerous forms of Xenos engagement on record. Each battle in which a C'tan has revealed itself is marked by severe casualties, anomalous battlefield phenomena, and the near impossibility of conventional classification. In most accounts, even when victory is achieved, it is achieved at a cost that far outweighs the tactical objectives of the campaign. One of the most frequently referenced examples is the Battle of Sanctuary 101, a campaign better remembered for the destruction of an entire convent of the Adepta Sororitas at the hands of Necron forces. While the involvement of a C'tan shard in this battle is disputed, the anomaly arises from eyewitness testimonies describing a luminous figure striding amidst the Necron phalanxes, radiating heat so intense that it melted ceramite. Official administratum records attribute the losses solely to Necron Gauss weaponry and the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Xenos force. However, Mechanicus marginalia associated with post-battle excavations suggest that readings consistent with stellar energy anomalies were recorded on the field. If a shard was present, its contribution would explain the sheer speed with which the Sororitas were overrun, their defences collapsing in a matter of hours. Another example is the conflict known as the War in the Heaven's Wake, fought in the Cadian sector prior to the 13th Black Crusade. In this instance, the engagement was not initially understood as an encounter with a C'tan shard. Imperial Guard regiments sent to contain a Necron uprising on the world of Belarus IX reported the sudden appearance of a singular entity during the campaign. Witnesses described it as a figure of living flame whose movements caused tanks to detonate without direct contact. Lasfire was absorbed harmlessly into its surface, while heavier ordnance such as battle cannon shells simply disintegrated before impact. The battle concluded only after the destruction of a Necron containment device, at which point the entity dissipated into fragments of dispersed light. Later, Mechanicus analysis would suggest that this was a shard of the C'tan known as the Nightbringer, weaponized by the local tomb complex before control was lost. The Administratum report sanitized these findings, listing the casualties as the result of anomalous plasma venting from unstable Xenos reactors. The fighting style of the C'tan differs fundamentally from any conventional army. Where Necron phalanxes operate with disciplined algorithmic precision, the C'tan themselves act as living singularities on the battlefield. They do not employ strategy in the human sense, rather they act as extensions of their essential nature. A shard of the Deceiver manipulates enemy morale, spreading illusions, disinformation, and psychic dissonance that causes regiments to fire upon one another or retreat in disarray. A fragment of the Nightbringer advances slowly but inevitably, draining life force from anything in its path, reducing soldiers to corpses with a gesture. The Void Dragon is said to manifest as storms of electromagnetic force, disabling vehicles and rendering advanced weaponry inert. In each case, the battlefield becomes not a clash of arms, but a demonstration of a natural law bent into hostile form. A particularly well-documented battle involving the C'tan occurred on the Forge world of Styges VIII, though the official records remain sealed under the authority of the Fabricator General. The incident began as a Necron assault on the planet's outer Manufactoria, with Mechanicus Skitarii and Legio Cybernetica forces deployed to repel the invaders. During the conflict, a containment vault deep beneath the surface was breached, releasing what Mechanicus sources later identified as a shard of the Transcendent C'tan. Unlike more defined shards linked to specific star gods, this fragment displayed an unstable pattern of abilities, alternating between destructive bursts of gravitational collapse and sweeping beams of coherent stellar energy. Entire maniples of Skitarii were annihilated in seconds, their bodies atomized where they stood. Cybernetica cohorts were reduced to molten slag, their machine spirits howling as their frames were undone at the molecular level. The shard was eventually brought down through a combined effort involving Mechanicus Graviton weaponry and the sacrifice of several Titan maniples, but the losses rendered Styges VIII crippled for centuries. Even in defeat, the shard did not die in the conventional sense. it fractured, with portions vanishing into subspace phenomena that remain unexplained. Another incident worth noting occurred in the Damnos campaign, later chronicled in detail by ultramarine sources. Here, the arrival of a Catan shard shifted the dynamics of the battle drastically. The ultramarines, despite their discipline and technological superiority, found themselves unable to counter the entity directly. Bolter fire was rendered irrelevant, power weapons passed through its form without effect, and even orbital strikes failed to secure more than temporary disruption. The solution lay not in defeating the shard militarily, but in sealing it once more within Necron technology. The battle is remembered less for the tactical maneuvers of the Astartes, and more for the revelation that even humanity's most elite warriors were powerless against the direct manifestation of a Catan fragment. Administratum records of Damnos emphasize the heroism of the Ultramarines while deliberately minimizing reference to the Catan itself. Yet within Mechanicus archives, the Damnos shard remains a key example of how containment, rather than annihilation, is the only viable response when such entities emerge. The combat style of the Catan is distinguished by its lack of concern for conventional warfare. They do not issue commands, coordinate tactics, or engage in strategy as mortals do. Instead, their presence warps the logic of the battlefield. Soldiers report overwhelming sensations of insignificance, as though their weapons and bodies alike were meaningless against a force that embodied the power of suns. Engagements with Catan fragments consistently record phenomena that defy conventional physics: temporal dislocation, spatial distortions, and the spontaneous ignition of matter. In one battle fought on the frontier world of Korath, Imperial Guard veterans reported that their own shadows turned against them, strangling soldiers before dissipating into black mist. Later analysis suggested this was the work of a shard manipulating photonic energy at a fundamental level. The result was mass panic, with entire regiments scattering without orders. Despite these overwhelming powers, the limitations of the Catan must also be noted. They are not gods in the sense of the warp entities, and their manifestations are constrained by the shards that bind them. A shard can be disrupted, broken, or recontained through sufficient application of force, though the cost is always immense. Necron technology remains the most effective means of controlling them, and the Imperium has only rarely succeeded in replicating such efforts. For this reason, Imperial battle doctrine concerning potential Catan engagement emphasizes containment, avoidance, and denial, rather than outright confrontation. The deployment of exterminatus protocols is considered an acceptable response when no other option presents itself, though whether such measures truly eradicate a shard remains uncertain. What unites all these recorded wars and battles is the recurring theme of distortion. The Catan are not conquerors in the human sense, nor are they tacticians. Their actions in battle resemble natural disasters more than military operations. To fight a Catan shard is not to fight an enemy, but to survive a cataclysm. Administratum analysts consistently compare such battles to planetary earthquakes, solar flares, or warp storms, with the distinction that these events possess intent. It is this combination of natural law and will that renders the Catan uniquely terrifying opponents. Even after thousands of years of Imperial history, the total number of confirmed Catan shard manifestations remains small. Yet their influence is disproportionate, for each recorded encounter reinforces the belief among the higher circles of governance that the galaxy harbours truths too dangerous for the wider population. Battles fought against them are remembered less for tactical outcomes and more for the administrative efforts to conceal the nature of what was faced. The soldiers who survive are often silenced, their testament is sealed, their memories overwritten by the official narrative. In this way, the politics of the Imperium and the realities of the battlefield intersect once more. What is remembered about these wars is not the Catan themselves, but the bureaucratic reconstruction of events designed to erase them from history. The history of the Catan cannot be separated from the ruins they leave behind. Even when their direct involvement in wars has been limited to the sudden emergence of a shard, the aftermath of these manifestations tends to reshape entire campaigns, sometimes entire sectors. Unlike conventional wars where a victor and a vanquished can be identified with clarity, the conflicts influenced by C'tan activity often conclude in confusion. Armies withdraw not because they are defeated by force of arms, but because the battlefield itself has become unstable, contaminated, or permanently altered in ways that no longer allow conventional operations. One such event is remembered in the fragmentary records of the Xanatorian incident. This conflict unfolded in the latter centuries of the 39th millennium, when a Mechanicus exploratory fleet uncovered a dormant tomb complex on the fringe of the Gothic sector. These subsequent excavation efforts inadvertently released a C'tan shard, believed by some to have been aligned with the Deceiver. The battles that followed were not fought against cohesive Necron legions, but against a tide of anomalies. Entire companies of Imperial Guard found their weapons rendered useless, ammunition disassembled into its raw components, and Vox transmissions replaced by coherent streams of binary code originating from no identifiable source. In the chaos, the fragment appeared to manipulate both Necron constructs and human soldiers alike, turning units against one another with deceptive illusions. By the time reinforcements arrived, the Guard formations had destroyed themselves in fratricidal combat, and the shard had vanished into the depths of the tomb world. The Administratum closed the record with the classification Internal Collapse of Morale. Though Mechanicus observers noted distinct energy signatures inconsistent with any known technology, the aftermath left the world uninhabitable, its atmosphere permanently destabilized by stellar-level radiation bursts. Another campaign that reveals the unique aftermath of C'tan involvement occurred in the Cronus system during the early years of the 41st millennium. The world of Cronus was subjected to conflict between Tau expansionist forces, Imperial Guard regiments, and a reawakening Necron dynasty. The emergence of a C'tan shard during this conflict was poorly understood by both the Imperium and the Tau, yet its presence was decisive. Orbital scans recorded bursts of radiation normally associated with coronal mass ejections, but localized entirely within ground-level combat zones. Tau weaponry, normally precise and efficient, malfunctioned en masse, while Guard armor units were torn apart by gravitational collapses that formed without warning. What is most significant about Cronus is the long-term aftermath. The shard's presence permanently destabilized the planetary crust, creating seismic zones that continue to render large portions of the world uninhabitable. While the Tau claimed limited territorial gains after the conflict, they withdrew within decades, citing irreparable environmental damage. The Administratum retroactively classified the system as a quarantine zone, officially due to Xenos contamination. In reality, it was an attempt to erase records of the shard's involvement. The Damocles Gulf has also seen unexplained anomalies believed to involve C'tan shards. Though records remain deeply redacted, some Administratum summaries mention celestial entities of non-warp origin interfering with campaigns in which both Tau and Imperial forces were present. The lack of specificity is notable. Whereas most wars are recorded with exhaustive precision, these engagements are documented only in vague references. Some Mechanicus accounts that have escaped deletion describe localized collapses of void shields, the sudden ignition of atmospheric nitrogen, and the total disappearance of entire platoons without trace. Whether these events were caused by C'tan activity remains unconfirmed, but the pattern matches other known encounters: sudden devastation, inexplicable battlefield conditions, and the eventual denial of the system to both sides. Another aftermath of importance is linked to the Medusa 5 campaign. While the primary threat during this conflict was a warp storm threatening to engulf the planet, there are scattered references to Necron activity that included the emergence of a stellar entity. The Imperial Guard regiments deployed at the time recorded phenomena resembling miniature novas erupting on the surface, annihilating regiments in seconds. Orbital scans later suggested the involvement of a C'tan shard, though Administratum records insist these were warp-based anomalies linked to the storm itself. Regardless of classification, the long-term impact was the complete destruction of Medusa 5. In this instance, the aftermath was indistinguishable from the larger catastrophe. but Mechanicus accounts emphasise that the Shard may have been attempting to manipulate the warp storm itself, a possibility that remains deeply troubling to any who study the records. The aftermath of Catan engagements often leaves behind technological relics, though these are rarely understood. On the world of Lyria, a short-lived Necron resurgence accompanied by the appearance of a Shard led to the complete destruction of a local Titan legion. The weapons of the Catan were not only lethal in battle, but they left residual zones where machine spirits refused to function, where cogitators collapsed into recursive errors, and where reactors became permanently unstable. These zones, still active centuries later, suggest that the energy manipulation employed by the Catan alters matter at a fundamental level. The Mechanicus has attempted to study such relic zones, but expeditions often result in failure, with entire research teams disappearing without trace. Administratum records of Lyria describe the world as mechanically inhospitable, a phrase that does not exist in any other archive entry, further suggesting deliberate obfuscation. In nearly every aftermath, the defining feature is not victory or defeat, but silence. Surviving soldiers are frequently reassigned, often to penal units or remote garrisons. Their testimony is erased from official logs. Entire regiments have vanished from records following encounters with Catan shards, their names removed as though they never existed. This bureaucratic erasure is itself a form of aftermath, one that ensures the knowledge of these beings remains contained within the highest levels of the Imperium. The logic is clear. The existence of entities that defy both the warp and material physics would destabilize the fragile ideological structures upon which the Imperium depends. Yet even with these measures, rumours persist. Across the Ultima Segmentum there are whispered tales of battles where the sun itself seemed to descend upon the field, of warriors turned to glass statues mid-charge, of entire fleets immobilized in orbit as if held by the hand of a god. These stories circulate despite censorship, carried by survivors who resist silence. In this way, the Catan leave a second kind of aftermath. Not only ruined worlds and annihilated armies, but also myth. The Administratum fights to reduce these stories to superstition, but among soldiers and civilians alike, they endure as evidence that the galaxy harbours forces beyond comprehension. Perhaps the most chilling aftermath is observed not in physical destruction, but in the patterns of disappearance that follow Catan activity. On the mining world of Draven, a shard manifestation led to a 3-day conflict in which Imperial Guard units fought alongside Mechanicus cohorts against Necron forces. The shard was eventually sealed by its own kind, drawn back into a Necron containment device after it began to destabilize. In the weeks following, however, the population of Draven collapsed. Entire hab blocks stood empty, their residents gone without evidence of evacuation or death. Administratum investigators sealed the world and declared it uninhabitable, citing toxic exposure from Xenos weaponry. Later analysis suggests that the shard may have consumed or dispersed the life force of the population, leaving no trace but absence. In this case, the aftermath was not ruin, but erasure. Through all these examples, the consistent reality emerges. Battles involving Catan shards do not end when the fighting ends. Their aftermaths linger in ruined ecosystems, broken populations, and silent archives. The Administratum reduces these to the language of bureaucracy, employing terms such as unsustainable engagement, environmental collapse, or Xenos contamination. The Mechanicus, when permitted, records more technical observations, though even these are heavily redacted before being shared beyond Mars. For the Imperium as a whole, the aftermath is managed through silence, but the scars remain evident to any who study the records deeply enough. The cumulative result of these wars and their aftermath is a paradox within the Imperium's political structure. The Catan are officially unknown, their existence denied in most open records, yet their influence shapes policies of containment, exterminatus, and silence. Every aftermath is absorbed into the machinery of empire, reduced to statistics, then hidden. What endures is not the truth of the Catan, but the fear that they leave behind. The impressions of the Inquisition regarding the Catan are among the most fragmented and contradictory of any subject in the archives. unlike the Adeptus Administratum, which seeks to erase mention of these beings, or the Adeptus Mechanicus, which pursues them with dangerous curiosity. The Inquisition preserves fragments of testimony in sealed vaults, available only to the most senior Ordo representatives. What emerges from these restricted documents is not a unified theory, but a series of impressions, scattered observations and conclusions drawn in the shadow of incomplete knowledge. To the Order Xenos, the C'tan represent a category of threat distinct from all others. They are neither warp entities, which can be countered with wards, faith, or psychic discipline, nor are they conventional Xenos, whose technology and biology can be studied, catalogued, and adapted into strategies of extermination. The C'tan exist outside of both categories, manifesting as material forces that mimic the properties of stars and fundamental physics. This has led some inquisitors to conclude that the C'tan should be classified not as aliens, but as cosmic predators, entities whose feeding extends to both the physical and immaterial planes. Their impressions consistently highlight the impossibility of killing such beings outright, noting that even when shattered, shards continue to act independently. The Order Malleus, by contrast, has struggled to place the C'tan within its framework of demonic study. Many inquisitors trained to see all unnatural power as warp-based have resisted the classification of the C'tan as something wholly different. Some reports describe early Malleus investigations into C'tan manifestations ending with inquisitors incorrectly applying exorcism rites and anti-demonic weaponry, only to watch them fail with lethal consequences. Where a demon may be banished by faith and psychic power, a C'tan shard remains unaffected, its substance immune to the touch of the warp. These failures have left a lasting impression within the Ordo. The C'tan are not to be engaged with methods designed for demons. Their presence instead demands the coordination of Mechanicus knowledge and Necron artifacts, resources rarely available to inquisitorial cells operating in the field. Among the Ordo Hereticus, impressions of the C'tan are coloured less by metaphysical analysis and more by the practical question of secrecy. The Hereticus is deeply aware of the danger that knowledge of the C'tan could pose to the faith of the Imperium. The Imperial Creed rests on the dual realities of the God Emperor and the ever-present threat of the warp. To acknowledge that there exist starborn entities, older than mankind and unconcerned with the warp, risks destabilizing that foundation. Reports from this Ordo therefore place emphasis not on studying the C'tan, but on containing rumours of them. Several inquisitors recommend the erasure of regiments, planetary populations, or entire sectors where exposure to C'tan phenomena has been too widespread. The impression recorded here is one of suppression rather than comprehension, where the very existence of the C'tan is considered an ideological threat as much as a physical one. Across all three major Ordos, the consistent impression is one of fear. Inquisitorial testimonies describe the C'tan as embodying inevitability, a force against which no defense is truly sufficient. Where demons may be resisted by will and Xenos defeated by force of arms, the C'tan defy such categorization. They are described as inevitable because their nature is not mutable. A shard of the Nightbringer will always manifest death, a shard of the Deceiver will always manifest deception. To the Inquisition, this creates a sense of futility in long-term planning. Their containment may be possible, but their eradication is not. This impression permeates the language of their archives, references to recurring inevitability, cyclical re-emergence and undeniable persistence recur across centuries of sealed reports. What distinguishes inquisitorial impressions from other records is the level of metaphysical speculation attached to them. Some inquisitors argue that the C'tan, while not warp entities, must still interact with the Immaterium in ways not yet understood. Reports from field agents describe anomalous behaviour in psykers exposed to C'tan shards. In some cases, psykers became inert, their powers rendered useless. In others, psykers experienced uncontrolled bursts of energy, leading to catastrophic possession events unrelated to any demonic incursion. These impressions have fueled the suspicion that while the C'tan are not demons, their presence disrupts the boundaries between matter and the warp in ways that cannot be fully anticipated. To the Ordo Xenos, this suggests that the C'tan are not merely predators of physical energy, but disruptors of the cosmic balance itself. The Inquisition also records impressions of their psychological impact. Soldiers exposed to C'tan manifestations are described as falling into despair far more rapidly than in battles against other foes. Even hardened veterans of the Astra Militarum, accustomed to the horrors of demonic incursions, report sensations of irrelevance when facing a C'tan. One account describes a regiment freezing in place as a shard advanced, not out of fear in the conventional sense, but from the overwhelming impression that their weapons and bodies alike were meaningless before such a being. Inquisitorial observers record this as an effect of existential dread, not psychic compulsion. This distinction matters greatly to the Inquisition, for it suggests that the C'tan imposed terror not through the warp, but through the raw recognition of their superiority. It is also notable that Inquisitors disagree sharply on the question of how many shards remain. Some reports suggest that there are only a limited number of active fragments, each associated with a known C'tan identity. Others argue that the galaxy contains countless minor shards, each capable of sudden activation if discovered within Necron tombs. This disagreement produces a tension within the archives. If the number is finite, containment may be possible with sufficient coordination and sacrifice. If infinite, then the galaxy exists in a permanent state of vulnerability, awaiting only the next awakening. Both impressions are recorded, but no definitive conclusion is reached. Another common impression within Inquisition records is the suspicion that the C'tan retain a degree of influence even while fragmented. Though they have been broken by the Necrons into lesser parts, their actions often appear disturbingly purposeful. Shards of the Deceiver, for example, have been documented acting in ways that seem designed to spread misinformation across Imperial records. In some cases, administratum archives were found to have been altered following shard manifestations, as though the being's influence extended into the structures of human memory and record keeping. Whether this represents true agency or coincidence is unclear, but Inquisitors who have observed such anomalies consistently argue that the C'tan possess more coherence than their fractured state should allow. What ultimately defines inquisitorial impressions of the C'tan is their treatment as an unsolvable problem. Where other threats can be reduced to doctrine, heresy eradicated, demons banished, Xenos exterminated, the C'tan remain in the margins of policy. Their records are sealed, their battles misattributed, their existence denied. Yet within the highest chambers of inquisitorial councils, their presence is acknowledged as one of the great constants of the galaxy. The impression is not of an enemy to be defeated, but of a truth to be endured. For the Inquisition, the C'tan are less an adversary and more a condition of the universe itself, older than mankind, older than chaos, and beyond the reach of human will. Among the Inquisition's sealed archives, the most troubling material consists not of theoretical speculation about the C'tan, but of battlefield reports where their manifestations can be traced. These documents are scattered, heavily redacted, and in some cases duplicated across different ordos with contradictory annotations. They do not present a clear picture of military history, but rather a sequence of anomalies, battles that should have followed predictable outcomes, yet did not. Inquisitorial archivists note that these anomalies cannot be reconciled within conventional frameworks of Xenos warfare. One such report originates in the late 36th millennium during a campaign against Necron tomb complexes in the Cadian Gate. Administratum records describe the action as a successful eradication of dormant Necron constructs with limited Imperial losses. Yet sealed inquisitorial files from the Ordo Xenos include testimony from survivors who describe the sudden manifestation of a radiant figure within the tomb. The figure is said to have drawn the energy from surrounding plasma weaponry, neutralizing an entire regiment's arsenal in moments. What is notable is not the destruction, many foes are capable of devastation, but the discrepancy between sources. The public administratum record erases any reference to anomalous phenomena, while the inquisitorial report labels the manifestation as a probable shard. The inconsistency is itself treated as an anomaly. a battle in which both defeat and victory are recorded depending on which archive is accessed. Another sealed account describes an action in the Ghoul Stars, where Imperial forces pursuing fragmented Necron fleets encountered what they believed to be a minor shard of the Deceiver. The report notes that the Imperial fleet recorded engagements in 3 separate star systems simultaneously. Each fleet commander believed themselves to be fighting independently, only to later discover that identical logs had been generated in multiple theatres of war. Inquisitors reviewing the data concluded that at least 2 of the engagements never physically occurred, and were fabrications imposed upon the perception of Imperial personnel. Yet the battle honours, casualties, and after-action reports were all consistent with real events. The impression drawn from this anomaly is that Catan manifestations are capable of producing not merely battlefield deception, but falsified realities with material consequences. The files remain sealed, as the implications for the stability of Imperial record-keeping are considered too great to reveal. In a separate case from the Segmentum Solar during the closing years of Millennia 37, a planetary purge of heretics devolved into confusion when reports describe a sudden eclipse that lasted for 31 days. During this time, Imperial commanders logged engagements against Xenos entities described in varying terms as skeletal, radiant, or metallic. What troubles archivists is that no 2 testimonies agree on the appearance of the foe, yet all agree on the same strategic anomalies: weapons discharging without effect, armoured divisions immobilised by the sudden breakdown of machine spirits, and psychers rendered unconscious without trace of warp activity. The Ordo Hereticus sealed the reports under the justification that the event represented a mass hallucination, possibly orchestrated by heretical cults. However, cross-referencing with Mechanicus logs shows the presence of star-level radiation bursts consistent with known Catan phenomena. The sealed conclusion describes the event as probable shard activation, with the Hereticus suppression attributed to the fear of doctrinal collapse, if news spread that the Emperor's light could be eclipsed for such a duration. The Inquisition's sealed reports also note anomalies in aftermaths, where the battlefield itself bore traces inconsistent with conventional warfare. On one world, unnamed in open records but referenced obliquely in Ordo Xenos archives, entire regiments were found to have turned to glass, their bodies flash-frozen mid-motion as though petrified by stellar heat. Administratum entries list the deaths as plague-related, while inquisitorial observers describe the battlefield as littered with crystalline statues, each indistinguishable from the soldier it once was. This anomaly is cross-referenced with Mechanicus radiation readings, which suggest a directed stellar discharge. The sealed commentary concludes that a shard of the Burning One may have been active, though the Inquisition admits no confirmation exists. Anomalous encounters also extend into recorded naval warfare. In the records of the Gothic sector during the 12th Black Crusade, Imperial fleets reported the appearance of a radiant entity within the void, which simultaneously drained void shields across multiple kilometers. Ships reported systems failing not from damage, but from total absence of power, as though the energy itself had been consumed. What makes this case distinct is that several Imperial commanders logged seeing different entities. Some described a burning figure, others a towering crystalline form, others a void of light. Inquisitorial commentary labels the event multi-identity projection, speculating that either multiple shards manifested at once, or a single shard imposed different perceptions upon each observer. Administratum accounts of the same battle omit all reference to the anomaly, attributing the fleet losses to chaos sorcery. Sealed reports often end with abrupt silences. One Ordo Malleus archive describes an Inquisitor leading a task force to intercept what was believed to be a shard fragment in Segmentum Pacificus. The report details the opening engagements in great detail, but terminates mid-sentence, with the final entry reading only, "The light cannot be contained. Recommend." The document ends without signature, seal, or closure. Marginal notes by later archivists state that no personnel from the task force were ever recovered, and that the star system in question is now designated off-limits to Imperial navigation. Whether the shard consumed the Force or erase the record itself is left unresolved. What emerges from these sealed encounters is a persistent pattern. The C'tan leave behind not merely devastation, but distortions in the fabric of Imperial record-keeping. Battles become inconsistent, testimonies contradict, outcomes appear in dual or triplicate forms. Inquisitorial archivists consistently mark such events as inconclusive or contradictory. Yet the very volume of such anomalies across the millennia indicates more than clerical error. The impression within the Ordo is that the C'tan are capable not only of destroying their enemies, but of reshaping the history of the event itself. The sealed commentary on these anomalies often acknowledges a secondary threat: the destabilization of the Imperial narrative. In a regime where faith and record are inseparable, the unreliability of history poses as great a danger as the physical destruction of armies. Inquisitors therefore often conclude that the suppression of such records is essential not only to prevent heresy, but to prevent the erosion of Imperial cohesion. To admit that a battle occurred in multiple contradictory forms is to undermine the very notion of certainty upon which the Imperium rests. The C'tan, therefore, are recorded not simply as enemies of the flesh, but as corrupters of memory and chroniclers of false histories. The final impression left by these sealed reports is a grim one. The Inquisition's role is to safeguard humanity not only against physical threats, but against truths too destabilizing to endure. In their encounters with the C'tan, Inquisitors find themselves unable to separate battlefield reality from cosmic anomaly. Every record becomes suspect, every testimony uncertain. The consistent recommendation, repeated across Ordo boundaries, is silence. Better that the Imperium never know these battles occurred, than risk recognition of what truly moves beneath the stars. The most sensitive records concerning the C'tan are those marked with the highest classification seals, restricted even within the Inquisition's own divisions. These files, often labelled under archaic sigils or indexed by numeric strings that bear no direct meaning, contain fragments of testimony and observational data deemed too destabilizing for dissemination. Many are incomplete, their pages interspersed with deliberate erasures or corrupted files, yet their survival in any form attests to the refusal of certain Inquisitors to allow total suppression. What follows is an assembled account of those fragments, annotated with final reflections drawn from Cross-Ordo's commentary. One classified transcript, believed to originate from the 37th millennium, recounts the interrogation of a lone survivor of an engagement in the Eastern Fringe. The individual, identified as a former captain of a planetary defense force, speaks in disjointed terms of a radiant figure that pulled the stars closer and caused the very horizon of the battlefield to collapse inward. The captain insisted that comrades were drawn into the light and never returned, though no remains were found. What marks this file as notable is not merely the testimony itself, but the marginalia by the presiding Inquisitor. Subject demonstrates no evidence of psyche taint, no sign of chaos corruption, narrative consistent with shard activity, recommend containment through termination. The conclusion reflects the Inquisition's unwillingness to allow such memories to survive, for even the act of witnessing was considered a threat to Imperial cohesion. Another classified entry, redacted to the point of illegibility, appears to describe an Ordo Xenos expedition into a dormant tomb world. What remains legible includes reference to an altar of fractured glass, a hum that is not sound, and the phrase, "the stars watched." The document ends with a notation that all subsequent references to the tomb were erased from Mechanicus charts, and the planet was redesignated under a false administrative name. The redaction itself serves as evidence. Even among Inquisitors, knowledge of the C'tan was to be buried beneath layers of falsehood. The sealed reports also include fragments of Mechanicus transmissions intercepted and held by the Inquisition, under the pretense of doctrinal review. One such message, originating from a Magos operating near the Halo stars, describes energy readings consistent with stellar manipulation. The Magos concludes, "Entity present demonstrates command over photonic cohesion. Mechanisms exceed categorization. Submission to Omnissiah suggested." The file ends with a handwritten note by an inquisitor of the Ordo Machinum. Recommendation refused. This is no god, but a predator of gods. The juxtaposition highlights the tension between Mechanicus' reverence for technological anomalies and inquisitorial suspicion of any entity that could usurp divine categories. Perhaps the most disturbing classified files are those that break entirely from conventional form. One, catalogued without context, consists of a single sheet bearing only the words, "They are not destroyed. They are diminished, awaiting the star's return." No author is listed, no seal affixed, and no cross-references exist. The ambiguity of the file has not prevented its preservation, though later annotations warn against reading it as prophecy. Still, its placement among the most restricted archives indicates that some within the Inquisition regard it as a direct observation rather than speculation. The classified vaults also preserve what are described as negative records. These are instances where entire campaigns vanish from the administratum rolls, but surface in fragmentary inquisitorial files. One such example involves an Imperial Crusade force dispatched to cleanse a cluster of tomb worlds in Segmentum Obscurus. No record of the campaign exists in public archives, yet an inquisitorial index lists the names of 27 regiments lost, with the annotation, cause, Stellar Predator. The absence of supporting detail has led archivists to speculate that the Crusade was not merely defeated, but consumed in a manner that erased its trace from history. Such anomalies reinforce the belief that the C'tan's power extends into the very frameworks of record and remembrance. From these classified fragments, the Inquisition's final perspective takes shape. The C'tan are regarded not only as ancient Xenos deities, but as entities whose presence destabilizes the very possibility of certainty. They do not merely destroy armies, they erase them. They do not simply corrupt technologies, they consume the concept of power itself. Inquisitorial commentary repeatedly emphasizes that, even in their shattered state, the C'tan remain capable of acts beyond comprehension. Shards, diminished though they are still classified as alpha-tier threats, with protocols of engagement focusing not on victory but on containment, distraction, or withdrawal. The Inquisition's final reflections are sober. The C'tan cannot be integrated into existing categories of Xeno's threat. They are not chaos, though they rival its destructive potential. They are not the warp, though their powers can eclipse it. They are not gods in the imperial sense, though they have been worshipped as such by lesser civilizations. They occupy a domain of their own, one that defies easy doctrinal control. The final notes across multiple ordos emphasize the necessity of silence. Records of C'tan activity are to remain sealed, testimony erased, and survivors terminated where necessary. To allow the knowledge of their persistence into the wider Imperium would invite theological collapse, for no faith can withstand the certainty that there exist predators of stars themselves. In conclusion, the Inquisition's perspective is not one of hope or strategy, but of containment. The C'tan cannot be destroyed in entirety, nor can their influence be erased. What can be done is to obscure their presence, to misdirect records, and to maintain silence. In this way, the Imperium protects itself not by triumph, but by ignorance. The final thought preserved in the archives is repeated across multiple sealed files. Better that humanity never knows than know and despair.